Hello, and welcome to Barbatus Catholic Podcast, the show where two Mexican dads talk about faith, life, and culture. We are your hosts,
Gustavo
and Walter, and today we are going to chat with AJ Enfield about Thomas Aquinas. But first, a word from our sponsor. And our sponsor today happens to be 50% of the operation. Our guest is 50% of the operation of our sponsor, Inkledeux Coffee and Podcast. Can you tell us a little bit more about Inkledeux, AJ?
Absolutely, yeah. So thank you guys for having us on. Having me on as a representative of us, I guess is the way to go with that.
That works.
But yeah, Inkledeux Podcast and Coffee is me and my cousin Brandon. He roasts delicious coffee. And our goal is to combine this idea of delicious beverages and meaningful conversation. And we would love to help you provide both of those things by giving you some coffee as your delicious beverage and listen to our podcast and see if that gives you some starters for some meaningful conversations.
Nice.
Where they can go to buy coffee.
Inkledeux.com. That's INKLEDEUX.com. Why? Because we like being complicated.
I mean, Barbatus Catholic Podcast.
Yeah, that's fair enough. Yeah. We're on brand.
All right, check them out, Inkledeux.com. Their 9 Rings blend and Fifth Love blends, they're fantastic. They're pretty good. And we are not just saying it to say it. We're also customers of Inkledeux. So
how long have you guys been doing the podcast now?
So the podcast, we're about 3 years in.
Wow.
And then coffee has been going that same amount of time, but Brandon had actually been doing coffee under another company before that. So he's got years of practice with the roasting and everything. So
nice.
He's really, really got it figured out at this point.
That's sweet.
Nice.
Yeah. It shows.
That's awesome. Well, thank you for coming today to hang out with us and having hopefully a meaningful conversation. The reason why we brought you here is because January 28th is St. Thomas Aquinas feast day, and we wanted to have someone who was like slightly more eloquent than us to talk about.
I'll see if I can live up to that.
A lot more eloquent.
Yeah, like Gustavo and I were like, Thomas Aquinas.
I know Thomas Aquinas is really important, but I don't know why necessarily.
I know that Matt Frad really likes him.
He's a big fan. Yeah, that's very true.
But other than that, it's like, okay.
I should know all these things. Maybe have somebody to talk about it. That's what I love about the podcast format, that isn't like, you don't necessarily need to be an expert, but having people on that edify you and you can learn from, that's really, really beneficial for me.
Oh, absolutely. I think that's one of the beautiful things about podcasts is the idea that it's just so accessible. This idea that there's an open seat at the table for a lot of people who there probably wouldn't be otherwise for these kinds of conversations. And so you don't necessarily have to be like Dr. Peter Kraft or anything like that to be able to get into a philosophical discussion.
Yeah. Because
it's going to be some steps before you get there.
You just have to be roommates with a guy that did 3-4 years of philosophy.
Yeah. So I did spend 3 years at seminary as a philosophy major, and then shortly thereafter moved in with Walter, who graciously let me pay rent based on what my salary was as a part-time youth minister out in the West Valley. In exchange for a lower rent, I did have to deal with him making fun of my Spanish practice.
That's actually true.
Los soldados no son poetas. Duolingo had some fancy phrases on there, and every now and then Walter pops his head out of his bedroom to see me in the living room. What in the world are you doing?
What are you doing? This is bicicletas son verdes. He's trying. The thing is, like, most of our conversations, more often than not, would like end up discussing philosophy and theology. I was like, AJ, why are there other religions in the world? Very basic kind of things. It was like 2013 that we were roommates.
Yeah. It would have been like the fall of 2012 into the spring of 2013. Yeah. Yeah. And it was great for me because when I'm kind of introducing myself to people, one of the first things that I normally start off with is I'm just sort of a massive nerd in general. Like whether we're talking about sports, whether we're talking about philosophy, religion, whatever it is, like I really enjoy geeking out on it and going deep.
Mm-hmm.
And so like I really enjoyed those conversations. And the other part of it that was great for me is that Walter, and I need him to pretend he's not listening to this right now because I don't want his head swelling or anything. He's a really, really intelligent guy, but he also does a really good job of keeping things kind of grounded in reality to where like, if I start going off on some stuff and he's like, okay, but why does that matter?
Yeah.
And I'm like, oh, you know what? Actually, it probably doesn't.
I don't know, but let me open another beer. Yeah, that was usually the case. You know, it's funny that we're going to ping pong a little bit on the topics here, but I think that it is like super funny that you ended up partnering with your cousin to sell coffee, because like you hated coffee with passion.
Oh yeah,
you're like you and your sock water, this and that.
Yeah. No. It was dirty water. That's all it was. I remember going on a retreat. We were both helping our buddy Zach, and Zach insisted that I had to have some coffee because how do you survive a retreat without it?
Mm-hmm.
And I was like, okay, fine, I'll have some. He was like, oh, let me put some cream and sugar in there. I was like, no, I already know I like cream and sugar. Why would I do that? I want to know if I like coffee. Oh, this is terrible. And
so you like the cream and sugar? Is the thing.
Oh, yeah. No. Cream and sugar is delicious. How are you going to go wrong with dairy and sugar? But it was one of those things, like it was a much, much longer time to figure out that like coffee was something that I could enjoy than it probably should have been, largely because pride is a real thing for me. And so once I had told everyone that I hated coffee,
you were going to stick with
it. Yes.
Yeah, you were going to stick with it.
Oh man, I will never get tired of telling that story or like asking you about it. So there's one thing that you and Brandon call yourselves, and that is blue collar scholars. Did you coin that term?
Actually, no, that was Brandon, and I love him for it. Like, because it's a really good way to kind of describe what we try to do, and kind of going back to what we were just talking about with our conversations. This idea of, the idea of a blue collar scholar, not someone who's necessarily fully invested in reading hundreds of books, but you don't have to be. Like your lived experience and things like that can be part of the formation required to have some of these conversations, and that deserves a seat at the table. So people who are thinking about serious and meaningful things, but maybe don't necessarily feel like they have the background to be engaging in the conversations with confidence. It's like, well, no, you actually should. And so that's kind of where we're coming from. He studied theology and philosophy a little bit before he switched to ASU and ended up in a major that would lead to a career where you could make money, as opposed to, philosophy, which I always joke, having a degree in philosophy means I'm qualified to ask the really important questions. Like, would you like fries with that?
Are you going to enjoy this in the car?
Yeah.
Love some In-N-Out. Okay. So how much Aquinas did you study in seminary as part of the philosophy course?
So a lot. One of the things that was really kind of cool about the way the program was set up at the Josephinum is that it was a very Thomistic approach to philosophy, in terms of when we would study ancient philosophy, it was largely looking at how this was kind of building towards Thomas. And when we looked at a lot of modern philosophy, a lot of times it was looking at kind of what had been lost in the time since Thomas. And sometimes it probably was a little bit overly simplistic in its approach, but it was very heavily Thomas influenced in pretty much all the classes. There were probably a couple of exceptions, but none that I remember, which tells you something about how impactful they were. Thomas really provides kind of the framework, not necessarily the idea that everything he said is 100% what we're going with in every class, but he provides a really solid foundation and starting point for the conversations. Because one of the things that made him so incredible is that he expressed the objections to the things that he was claiming better than a lot of the people he was arguing with did. You hear about the idea of people making straw man arguments where they like intentionally weaken somebody's argument just so they can knock it down and feel really smart.
Mm-hmm.
One of my priestly professors at the seminary talked about how Thomas, instead, he did steel man arguments, where he would do everything he could to make the argument as strong as possible so that he knew when he knocked it down, it was done. There's no coming back from this.
Mm-hmm.
Nice. I think that in one of the articles that I did like a little bit of research for this episode said that he loved debating.
Mm-hmm.
Like in universities at the time, I think he went to University of Paris at some point.
Yeah.
And the faculty would like just be in like one of these common areas, and people would just like go and debate professors, debate ideas and whatnot. And that some of these professors wouldn't like, they would dodge like the hard or difficult questions. But the way that the Sumatheology is structured is basically a debate. For every proposal that he has the counter arguments and then the pro arguments, I guess.
Yeah. So the way, and this is part of why I think Thomas is coming back so strong and why there is so much kind of reference to Thomas happening again now, is because the content, for one thing, is incredible, but that's always been true. But I think one of the things that's really kind of connecting with people now and helping them is the fact that there is this kind of set format to how he does it. And it makes it very easy to kind of follow the points that he's making, because he'll start off with a question. And then he'll start off with the answer he disagrees with being the one put forward. And he'll say, it seems that, so is it possible to know that God exists? And he'll say, it seems that it is impossible to know for certain that God exists. And then he'll list out all these different reasons. And then he'll do the said contra. But on the other hand, that's when he comes in and he'll like piece by piece takes apart each of those arguments before giving kind of his conclusive statement of, therefore we can know that God exists because of this, this, and this. And it's such a systematic and straightforward approach. And I think in a world that has become increasingly kind of relativistic in its approach to everything, and isolationist too. Like instead of, we don't really like to engage with the other side. So to have someone who starts off by saying, well, no, actually there's good reasons to think this way. If we look at this, this, and this, and then comes back and with complete honesty and simplicity, really. I mean, which I know is a hard thing to say about philosophy, but he really does. Like, he's very kind of simple in his approach to it, where he says, but that's ignoring this thing. And so because of this argument doesn't hold water, which leaves us with this as the truth.
And the Sumatheology is basically a big referendum of like the presence of God, right? It breaks it down to can you just boil down a little bit what the Sumatheology is and its significance?
So the Sumatheology it's the sum of all theology. Like literally, it was basically set out to be a complete catechesis, explaining everything from the existence of God up through the sacraments and all these kinds of things. It never ended up being completed. Like, it's broken down into different books with different sections. It never did end up being totally completed. But so it's incredibly comprehensive. And so for the questions about God's existence, and some of the most famous things that we know from Thomas comes from his first book, which is on kind of like natural theology. What can we know about God? Relying primarily on our senses rather than on revelation. And so that's where you get like the 5 arguments for the existence of God and things like that. But trying to sum up what it is the whole thing was supposed to be a summary of all that there is in the science of the study of God.
Yeah. Yeah.
And the fact that he mentions it would be a work for like beginners. It's like, right? That's honestly like trying to read the Sumatheology is like kind of daunting. You look at it, it's like reading Augustine's Confessions. It's like,
Yeah, it's next level stuff. You know,
it's like you have to be an intellectual.
But from what I read, you know, and listened to a couple of videos on it, it's like Thomas knew that we have the capacity to understand it. You know, so that's kind of like him trying to boil it down for the Joe Schmo, right? And I think it's incredible how some of these themes obviously play out in different facets, right? But one that really struck me was St. Josephine Bakhita. The fact that she said, you know, seeing the sun, the moon, and the stars, I said to myself, who could be the master of these beautiful things? I felt a great desire to see him, to know him, and to pay him homage. So even somebody like centuries after, right? We still have that inkling of like connecting to something greater, even though we don't fully comprehend it.
Yeah. And what's really, I think what makes it so incredible that St. Thomas did put so much time and energy into answering some of these questions is that if you think about it, he really did kind of live in a time and place where he could have been forgiven for taking a lot of it for granted. You know, he was living in a Europe that was Catholic. Like you really didn't have an option.
Yeah.
They were starting to come into contact with some of the Moors and some of the Islamic states to the east and the south. But for the most part, like the idea of questioning the existence of God was not a common thing.
It was like 12th century, right?
Yeah. Yeah. So we're
12th, 13th century.
Yeah. I was going to say, I think it's 1200s. Yeah. But it was a time where the idea that he would take so seriously the idea of defending the concept of God's existence and the ability to know it, which tend to be questions that we associate with much earlier, like the Greek skeptics and things like that, or much later with like Descartes and the various Enlightenment thinkers who all became convinced that knowing anything is a completely impossible task.
Well, it became a thing of faith versus reason, right? And the Greeks were more in tune with the reasoning and Aristotle and all these things. And on the other side, you know, I don't remember who said the quote, like, what does Greece have to do with Jerusalem? You know, but the fact that Jerusalem was the epicenter of faith, essentially, but they were never in conflict. You know, I think that's what Thomas was trying to really boil it down to, is like, no, they exist within each other, you know?
Well, wait, but I think that Plato was very influential before Thomas, and then Thomas started to bring Aristotelian.
Pretty much, yeah. So really, that same contact with some of the Islamic states is actually what brought Aristotle back to Europe. A lot of Aristotle's texts and things had either fallen into disuse or been lost kind of to the sands of time. But Plato had still been a really big deal. And he was a huge influence on like St. Augustine in the early days of the church and everything. And so with Thomas, as he was getting access to Aristotle, there were a lot of people who kind of going back to that idea of what does Greece have to do with Jerusalem? Like, well, what do we need this for? And Thomas was like, well, I don't know, maybe we should look.
Yeah.
And he did. And he found a lot of things that he felt were some of the heresies that had kind of sprung up that had a lot to do with like that separation of matter and spirit and the idea that one is evil and one is good and all this kind of stuff. A lot of that kind of naturally flows from Plato's thoughts, because he's got this, there's the form, the ideal reality of the thing. And then there's the matter, the way we encounter it in the world, which is just an imperfect, messed up version of it. And Thomas was like, well, but Aristotle talks about the idea that these two things are actually united, that the form has to exist within, universal has to exist within the particular. And I think that's a helpful thought. I think that can help us avoid some of these mistakes. And from there, Thomas has that uniquely saintly gift of true humility, where, you know, because he quotes in the Summa Plato, Aristotle, great Christian thinkers, and also some of the great Jewish and Muslim like philosophers of the time as well, or from the centuries past as well. Like anything that he found that pointed towards truth and was useful for explaining the realities of God, he was like, oh, okay, cool. This will work.
Got it. Mm-hmm.
That's awesome. So, you were in seminary like 2010?
Yeah, 2009 through 2012, for 3 years of what they call college seminary, which is just my undergrad work. So I left with I really wanted it to be a BS in philosophy, but instead it's one of the arts and not the sciences, which is mildly upsetting just because I always liked the joke about having a BS in BS.
But okay, so we're talking about like maybe like 12 years ago and maybe even further than that, seminaries teaching or forming future priests in Thomistic philosophy. I read that kind of Thomistic philosophy was put aside after Vatican II, and that didn't give a lot of details why, but I know Dr. Peter Crift and Matt Fradd, they're like very interested in bringing it back, and it's kind of like making a comeback in
It's Bishop Barron's hero.
Yep.
So can you speak to that a little bit?
So I think part of what happened is the chaos that comes in the immediate aftermath and at the time of a council is just part of it, is the idea of, I was listening to the Pillar Catholic podcast a couple of weeks ago, and they were talking about this idea of like Vatican II will probably not actually be a settled thing until there's no one with an actual living memory of being there at the council, because there's too much of that ability to remember your specific conversations you were having with your specific people and coming up with the idea that that is what the purpose of the entire council was. And so I think this idea of people who, not always with malicious intent, or perhaps not even intent at all, kind of hijack aspects of a council and run with it. This idea of modernizing. And I think part of it is that the modern world has been very kind of dismissive of the scholastic period in general of the Middle Ages, and Thomas kind of as the sort of frontman for it. And so I think there was a desire to try and respond with something that the culture would find more credible. And since the culture was kind of dismissing Thomas, okay, then we need to go ahead and leave Thomas alone as well for now. He was always still kind of talked about very respectfully and very reverently. But yeah, I think in the years since then, I think part of what's happened is that we've, number one, realized there was a reason he was the basis for so much for so long, where a lot of, so like the work of JP2 and St. Edith Stein and some of these other people, and their philosophy was not necessarily heavily Thomistic, but it still took Thomas as kind of a base. And they focused on some different ways of coming to the knowledge, but the questions they were asking were the same. And they still looked to and cited Thomas and some of his answers, and that recognition that we can't really engage with the world on purely scientific terms. And so we need to go back to the idea that there is this underlying truth, that our senses are one way to come to know truth, but they're not the only tool we have and not the only tool we should use. You could go through your entire life trying to fix everything with a screwdriver. You could. And there are a lot of things that you'd probably be able to do kind of well enough. But you know what? If you had a hammer, it'd probably help a lot more on some of them, or a wrench and those kinds of things. And I think that's part of the realization that came back, is that we have this incredible variety of tools available to us in the Catholic tradition to help us know the truth, explain the truth, understand the truth, and defend the truth. And for decades, at least, we were fighting with one hand tied behind our back because we just refused to use it. And I think the Dominican order, for obvious reasons, love for one of their own, has done a really good job of just sort of pointing out, hey, this question that you're all struggling with, you know who did a pretty good job wrestling with this question at one point?
This guy.
Our guy, Thomas Aquinas.
This dude.
Tommy Boy.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. You remember that guy we called the angelic doctor? Yeah. He might have something to say.
That is, I love how you say it because that's like very you. Hey, remember this thing that we already explained in this book over here that is gathering dust?
Yeah.
Maybe we should open it and read a little bit.
It could help. I'm just saying.
For the longest time, I thought that Thomas Aquinas was French, but he was not. He was Italian.
Right.
Mm-hmm.
He studied in France, but I thought it was one of the things that I found about his life is that he or his family rather wanted him to become like the abbot of Monte Cassino, which is like the most famous monastery of Saint Benedict founded it.
Yeah.
To add like another
check mark, right?
Check mark to the family
Yes.
pedigree or whatever. But instead, it's like, well, I'm just gonna go with these hippies, Dominicans that are like beggars and preachers. It's like I can go to the other beggars that are the Franciscans, but I'm just gonna preach the word of God.
Yeah.
So I thought that it was funny how it was like I would never like think of Thomas like a rebellious kind of man, but at the time it's like, okay, what was the decision? It's like, no, I am not going to go to the Benedictines. I'm going to follow this other order.
Well, they actually kidnapped him, right?
Yeah. It's great because like the funny thing is, I think Thomas would agree with you and say that he was not rebellious. Like it was just one of those things. Like he wasn't doing it to be rebellious. He was doing it because,
it's the right thing to do.
God trumps mom and dad. Sorry, guys.
Mm-hmm.
And so because he was one of the things that is phenomenal about him, and the story of his kidnapping kind of highlights it too, is as brilliant as he was, he also had this kind of perpetual innocence to him. And so like, if he had viewed it as being an act of rebellion against his parents, there's no doubt he wouldn't have joined the Dominicans.
Mm.
But he didn't see it that way. It was, my parents are in agreement that the religious life is where I should be. And it feels that God is calling me to the Dominicans. So I guess I'll go there. But yeah, they weren't happy about it. And so they wanted to try and, block him from being able to pursue this vocation. And so they basically, his brothers like kidnapped him and locked him in a room with a prostitute. Like
There
basically trying to be like,
as brothers do. I mean, if you have brothers, right? I mean, who hasn't gone through that?
who among us has not kidnapped a sibling and then tried to, okay, no, never mind. I'm not going any further with that analogy. But yeah, no, like they did that to try and, block him from being able to do that and hopefully kind of shame him to where he would stay and do wherever they sent him. Instead, Thomas, this like slow, very methodical person, not in what we would consider athletic shape or condition, grabs a hot poker out of the fire and like drives the woman away, and then goes back and joins the Dominicans. Like,
There you go.
Yeah, I think he carved a cross on the door.
yeah, like I don't remember.
I guess you can go back.
I don't remember the order on it, like whether he drove her out first and then put the cross on the door to like try and prevent his brothers from trying anything stupid like that again. Whether he put the cross on the door as like a warning, you should get out of here because this is a holy place. And
Next time, it's your back, lady.
Ooh.
That would have been something.
Yeah, no, she seems to have read it that way because she took off running either way.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
Which again, to be fair, if someone in a closed space with you grabs a hot poker out of the fire and starts waving it around, I'm not going to ask a whole lot of questions.
No,
either.
I'm out.
It's
Yeah,
just,
real quick.
I'm out.
Fight or flight.
Mm-hmm.
What you said about not being athletic is, I think that's one of the things that I'm like, Thomas, you're like my guy. It's like I can relate to someone being slow and maybe 300 pounds. From what I have read, there was one story about him walking everywhere instead of going on a donkey because the Dominicans had donkeys instead of horses to spare the donkey. Which I think is like very noble that he would just walk instead of using the donkey because he knew that he was heavy set,
Yeah, he was just in general a very, very sweet man. And he had a reputation for like, again, being very kind of naive and trusting as well, type of thing. Like he just sort of assumed the best out of everyone. And so there's one story that's kind of like apocryphal, like we don't know if it really happened or not, but something about some of his brothers when he was a novice. So his brothers in the Dominicans, not the ones who kidnapped him.
Yeah.
Religious brothers.
Right. There we go. But like making some comment about a pig flying out the window as they were like trying to mock his naivete. And he went over to take a look and they were making fun of him for believing it. And his response was something to the effect of, I would much rather be a fool for believing that pigs would fly than be believing that my brothers would dare to lie to me. Wow. And it was like,
ooh.
Yikes.
Okay.
All right. Well,
all right. So, off to confession.
Yeah. Okay. So these jokes are pretty much done now, I think. Yeah.
All right, party pooper.
Yeah, exactly.
That definitely killed the mood for sure.
All right, no more jokes for Thomas.
So, one of the kids are mean, and kids when Thomas was the little boy were mean as well. So they called him the dumb ox. Poor thing. Like I have like pity for little Thomas. I just want to hug him and be like, everything's gonna be all right, But he was studying under Saint Albert the Great, which that's a whole. We could do like a whole different podcast on Saint Albert the Great. But he prophesied to those kids. Well, he didn't know that he was prophesying, but he told those kids that the bellowing of the dumb ox will be heard around the world. I think that's a beautiful revenge.
Well, and it's one of those things too. As a teacher, I love the story because the reason his classmates called him a dumb ox was because he didn't participate much in class. Like he didn't speak out. He wasn't one of the kids sharing a bunch of the answers. But what St. Albert the Great realized was that he was quiet because he was contemplative.
Yeah, introspective, right?
Exactly. When he wasn't just taking in information to spit it back out, he was taking everything in and actually taking his time processing it and all of that. And so that as a teacher for me, I love that story because it's a big reminder for me to remember that like, you've got to find multiple ways to kind of evaluate where a person's at in terms of their understanding. Thomas was never dumb. Like it was purely a matter of he was, I guess, sort of dumb in the traditional sense in that he didn't speak. And so made himself an easy target again I'm assuming he was probably always a larger lad. And so like he was kind of an easy target for his classmates anyway. And then he was very quiet. But yeah, like there is something beautiful about the idea of one of his teachers, a saint no less, being the one to recognize that, oh, no. This is a case of still waters running deep rather than a stagnant pond.
Yeah.
That's super interesting because it's just like personality wise and what's the word that I'm trying to think of? Not the character, but you can be the character if you work on what is that the quiz that I sent you and Ivan to see, like if you were a sanguine temperament. Thank you. Like the temperament of Thomas Aquinas, like I would love to figure out what kind of, I don't think he was melancholic or
or something like that. I've taken so many of those quizzes, but I don't remember what any of them mean.
I know.
Yeah.
This is, and you can probably get like different results from anyone that each one that you take. But besides the point, that sometimes, I guess the moral of the story is if someone is quiet, don't assume that they're dumb.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, and I mean, again, like even just sort of more broad than that, like don't make assumptions about like why a person is where they're at.
Yeah, the way they are.
who knows? Who knows what's happening in their lives, where they're coming from, what they're dealing with, and how they're approaching it. Much better to actually, I don't know. Again, going back to that idea of meaningful conversations that we had mentioned before, maybe talk to them, figure some stuff out.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. So we have been talking about the Summa, but we know that it's not complete. So there's the first part, and there's the second part that is actually broken down into two parts. Mm-hmm. There was supposed to be a third part, but why didn't he not finish it?
I love this story so much. So St. Thomas, while he was still working on the text, he was also a man of deep and devout prayer. And so this was reported by one of his brothers at the time, who did like a biography on him shortly after his passing, talking about the idea that he had gone by the chapel late one night and heard Thomas and someone else speaking in the chapel. And apparently Thomas was having an ecstatic vision, like of God revealed to him in the Eucharist. And, the Lord spoke to him and said, Thomas, my son, you have written well of me. What would you have as your reward? And Thomas's response was, only yourself, Lord. And afterwards, he came out of the chapel and said, in comparison to what I have seen, all that I have written is as so much straw. Mm-hmm. And to keep in mind what straw was used for at the time, it was like bedding and like the corner of the room that was the toilet as the absorbent material for it. And so it's like, he was saying that this Summa that he had been working on, his life's work, this thing that got God to speak to him and say, you have written well of me, my son. It's like, no. Actually, being in God's presence, everything that I've done is just as so much straw. And so he did continue to work on it, but like, the fervor for it wasn't there as strong anymore. And I believe he didn't live terribly long after that experience. But yeah, and the other thing I love about God appearing to him and saying, what would you have as your reward of me? I think it's really interesting that I can only think of two people who God has given like that blank check to, King Solomon and St. Thomas. And I think it's really telling that God definitely knows who he's asking, because both of them give great answers.
Yeah.
Like if God appeared to me tonight and asked me that, even having just had this conversation about how perfect St. Thomas's answer was, I'm not super confident that's going to be mine. Like God knows better than to put me in that position.
Porsche, definitely Porsche, God.
Yeah.
That'd be sweet.
If the next time the Powerball gets up over like $1 billion, if you could just go ahead and let that come my way, I'd really appreciate it. Yeah. But like the people who he chooses instead, choose wisdom in the case of Solomon. And Aquinas with an even better answer.
Yeah, only yourself.
Yourself, Lord.
Just yourself.
What more could I ask for other than you?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting to see that his life's work paid off, because that's what we all want, right? To be face to face with God and say, I just want to be in your presence forever.
Can you imagine if we have a vision of God and it's like, you have podcasted well about me? Oh.
I'd probably still go with the Porsche. No, I don't know. But no, I mean, the fact that his life's work, here's a good lesson, right? I mean, for all those listeners out there that sometimes we get too much into our own head, into our work. Mm-hmm. Is like, well, just put things into perspective a little bit, right? For him, everything went by the wayside when he was greeted, and in the presence of God. So totally, very telling, and it's a very good lesson, for to hear that answer. It really puts things into perspective,
and it shows that he maintained the right approach to his work too. Mm-hmm. Like. I'll be honest.
It was never about him.
Exactly. Because if I were to try and write a book summarizing even one small part of theology, I am absolutely writing it in part, at least, for the great 5-star reviews on Amazon from people
sure.
like loving my book and telling me how smart I am. And I want to hear from all these people talking to me about
coming on these podcasts.
Impact. Yeah, exactly. Getting invited onto podcasts like Barbatus for my incredible contributions and things.
The media tour,
Exactly.
There you go.
The junket.
But for him, it was purely about serving God. And once he realized he had done that,
it was good.
Mm-hmm. So what's your favorite quote from Thomas Aquinas?
Ooh, let's see. So it's hard for me to narrow it down to a quote because I tend to think of him in like chunks.
Yeah.
I guess my favorite quote would be the one about only yourself, Lord. But if like the one that always I kind of come back to with him the most is, we mentioned him just sort of briefly earlier, the 5 proofs for the existence of God. Because I've spent the last 7 years now teaching theology to like 5th graders and now up through juniors in high school. And it's kind of one of those things where it has been on the top 3 of my most useful tools in terms of talking to students about God, because it's like, no, look, we'll talk about the Bible later. Let's just talk purely in terms of the way the world works, these things we can all see. And then after I've gone through this, you tell me whether you think it makes sense to believe that there is a God or not. And then we can go from there. And so he does an incredible job of, again, just setting that baseline where a conversation can happen. Because so often, especially now teaching high school students, you walk in and they want to resist. They want to push back on it. A lot of them have been in Catholic school their entire life. They've never had the opportunity to resist. And now they've got a teacher standing up there telling them, I want all of your questions. Give them all to me. Let's go. Like, all right, well, let's see how you feel about this when we get real on it. And so being able to be like, okay, no. Yeah, go ahead. Question God's existence. But actually question it. Don't just say you're questioning it as an excuse to be lazy and not actually think about it anymore. If you're really questioning it, let me put out these pieces of evidence. And if you can't argue against them, I feel like you've got to give me at least this as a starting point.
Exactly.
Nice.
That's awesome.
How many of those students have you encountered?
It's tough to say because it's one of those things where in each class, there's probably just a couple of students who will actually ask the question. And then there's a bunch of them who are thinking it and not willing to say it out loud because they're still more afraid of consequences than they are insistent on establishing their own independence now. But yeah, I've definitely had a few, and I won't say that there are a lot of them who I have converted by that, but I will say that I've seen a lot of hearts open to the possibility because of
Got it.
Well, praise be to God.
That's beautiful. Yep.
Well, I don't think we're going to get any better than that. Let's just close on that. And we want to thank you so much for coming over, AJ. It's been a wonderful time.
So maybe one quick last thing. If somebody's going to want to get a Thomas Aquinas for Dummies book, as an introductory, what would you recommend?
So Dr. Peter Kraft, he kind of borrowing from that sort of Thomistic tradition as well, is really, really good at make sure you're getting one of his intro books. Because like when he's writing something intentionally as an introductory level thing, he does really, really good at keeping it at that level.
Yeah.
Or my personal favorite author is G.K. Chesterton, and he did a biography on St. Thomas Aquinas. And Chesterton is incapable of not engaging in some philosophy on the side on any topic he's writing about. And so he does a pretty good job. And if you enjoy reading sarcasm, the G.K. Chesterton book is the way to go. He's really, really good at writing sarcasm.
Yeah, totally. So now we need an intro book onto Chesterton to read the intro book into Thomas.
We're going to have to bring AJ back to talk about Chesterton.
You're speaking my language.
I don't know. Can you imagine? We talked about like the possibility of having a Saint G.K.
Oh, for sure.
One day.
Yeah, the cause was opened, and like I'm hopeful. I'm not. I don't expect it to be a quick process.
Maybe not in our lifetime, but
but if we can get him up to a servant of God status, at least I'll still have so many like little holy cards that I'm handing out to all of my students for the rest of my life.
Can you imagine like GK and Thomas in heaven just like shooting it, like just talking?
Couple big dudes just sitting
big
there
dudes
chatting.
like taking a big part of heaven up.
Well, but that was the main reason why we thought that it would be great, because like Chesterton is like rotund kind of guy, so
walking around with his stogie and
and his gun, to defend his bride if needed.
Yep, I love it.
Yeah, it's beautiful.
He would fit in here in Arizona.
This big trench coat.
Mm-hmm. That part.
Trench coat.
He'd probably lose weight with that trench coat in the summer, dude. Yeah. Okay, next episode. That's for sure.
All right. Well, Inkledeux.com, INKLEDEUX.
That's the one. Yep. And on all the social medias, it's at Inkledeux as well. Same spelling, obviously. Because again, we like to make it complicated, but not that complicated. We're not going to change up the spelling on you for each
You're
app.
still going to find it eventually. It's just
And
that coffee that AJ was talking about.
I'm going to try a Google search on that later and just see what happens.
That's going to... You need to tell me what happens. We can do this after we finish rolling. But for now... we want to thank you for listening to this episode of Barbatus Catholic Podcast, a show where two Mexican dads talk about faith, life, and culture. If you like the podcast or got something out of this episode, please share it with your friends and family. Subscribe, like, comment, rate, review, turn the bell on. You know the drill. If you haven't, and if you're feeling extra generous, you can buy us a coffee. Go to buymeacoffee.com/Barbatus and follow the instructions. We cannot guarantee that we're going to buy coffee with it. We might buy alcohol with it, but you still get a shout out if you
we'll buy some Kahlua.
We'll buy some Kahlua. There we go. And well, if you don't like the podcast, well, just keep it to yourself and let others make their own mistakes. You can find the show notes for this episode at barbatuscatholicpodcast.com, and on social media we are on Instagram at Barbatus Catholic Podcast. And bless us, Casey.
Pray for us.
Until the next time.